and it'd be gorgeous. It'd be beautiful. It'd be a veritable. It'd be a veritable.
So we talked back in 2012 about your early work on your plays Hitch and Beats.
Yep.
And how in those plays there were narratives of mobility. Sometimes the characters were taken on literal journeys across Europe, in the case of Hitch.
Yeah.
And your use of the journey form seemed to be an opportunity to launch a political trajectory that took the individual protagonist out of the geographical and political limitations of their situation to connect with broader communities of protest and political activism. And then I was really interested in your subsequent work in Rantin and Heads Up, that you shifted focus to think about the construction and composition of cities and states. I'm wondering now, a few years after those productions, looking back over 10 years of experimental storytelling,
retrospectives already,
whether you consider that some of those themes have continued to be central to your work, or whether there are new things that have started to come in that you've been grappling with in later pieces like Mouthpiece.
It's a really interesting question, and I think the first thing to say is that, like, for me, and I imagine I'm not alone in this as a writer or theatre maker, quite often those like that sort of more coherent thematic understanding of like an overview of the work can only really be like achieved after the fact. That I'm not like setting out to go, okay, I've explored this, now how do I develop that in this way. Like often the impulse to write is coming from a place that's much more instinctive than that. But I think certainly looking at the work you can see some of that. Like Mouthpiece very much is a two-hander between two people that come from very different sides of Edinburgh, and there's sort of other big presences in the play that are almost like a character in themselves, and one of them is the presence of the play itself. It becomes quite meta-theatrical in that way. But there's the other big presence of Edinburgh, and so I guess in some ways you could draw a connection there where Rantin and Heads Up, and there's a sort of body politic that's kind of inferred in some way, but also more than that, it becomes about the people gathered in the room in the theatre itself as a kind of community. It has a slightly more antagonistic relationship with that community and asks maybe slightly more difficult questions of who isn't in the room in that community than some of those earlier works. But definitely there's still a question about a bigger us, about a we, that's like quite big in the work.
That's certainly something that I've observed, that there's an ongoing struggle with relationships with different types of community in these plays.
Yeah.
So, as you say, first of all, there's the assembled audience community, made up of individual theatre goers who have come together to synchronise their heartbeats, as you observe in Mouthpiece somewhat wryly.
Yeah.
And then there's the communities that we encounter in the stories that you tell.
Yeah.
The various different types of groupings of people in different situations across the world. And then there's a sort of aspirational community, a political community in the making, which seems to be suggested to exist beyond our experience of the plays, something that we're moving towards collectively. So community's really important. But then there's this great moment in Mouthpiece when one of the characters, Libby, a 40-something writer, declares an interest in helping people from the community that Declan, the young artist, is part of. And he doesn't let that go. He kind of calls her up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
My community.
Yeah.
It seems that communities are really problematic to him in that respect. It's not the answer per se, but it's something to constantly struggle with, and it's also something that is subject to exploitation and appropriation.
I think what Declan calls out in that scene is, for him, though that word has only ever been used by people with a particular agenda that want to frame his life in a particular way. and he turns out to have been right about that, I think. So the actual line is, right, I get it, you're one of those cunts, or something like that. And so I think you're right. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you'd make of this conversation, for example. Do you know? But it's true that community is a big thing in my work, and that like some idea of a collective understanding of ourselves, that it might be in opposition to the sort of more top-down values of enforced individualism that are quite fundamental to how our society functions. That's like it actually took me writing things like Beats and co-writing Chalk Farm and writing Rantin and stuff like that. Like I was saying earlier, it took me having written them to notice that, you know, that was a recurring theme, and it's lovely to have that noticed and then expanded on in terms of the discussion around that in such a lucid and beautiful way by folk like yourself. That's just really rewarding. But in terms of community being problematic and difficult, I think in Mouthpiece it definitely is. There's another more recent play called Bubble, which had an outing. It was written for the RCS, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, masters students, but it's going to have another outing. I think by the time this goes online, it'll probably be okay for me to have said this. That Theatre Uncut are going to release it for people to have a look at, and it's all set online, so it's set in this kind of quite fractured community of academics and students in a contemporary sort of university campus, and it's all written in the social media posts of this kind of loosely formed community at a time when a sort of free speech crisis or crisis scandal is kind of running through the school, that becomes an escalating kind of like media story, and the nature of community is quite big in that in a sort of different way as well, because each of these voices and individuals and people are definitely atomized from each other in the space. I mean, there's no hard and fast rules about how to stage it, but they're not sharing physical space. But definitely the decisions they make and the values that they choose to stand for are impacting on each other's lives in quite profound ways. And I liked what you had to say about the imagined potential future community that the work might be leading towards. I don't really have anything to add about that other than that's quite a rewarding thing to have reflected back, because if the work can be doing that, then that seems good.
I'm wondering what ethical concerns have arisen from you thinking about your place in relation to those different imagined and real collections of people.
Yeah.
Because in Heads Up, which takes this broad focus approach to thinking about the different coexisting stories of people within the city, in the lead up to and the aftermath of a cataclysmic event, there's the play's written in the second person, which really cleverly implicates the audience in all of the stories that you're telling. But then there's this one moment when you very briefly shift to the third person, and you tell us about a man sitting at his desk, and he's decided that it has to be this way. There's a concern there that seemed to me to have carried you through into Mouthpiece, thinking about the role of the writer and the responsibility of the writer in telling these stories and representing these marginalised lives.
So a Heads Up, it's like, it just seemed necessary. Heads Up was written in a kind of some cliched thing to say, but it was written in a kind of fever dream. Do you know what I mean? Like it was a very, the conditions under which it was made were short and intense and underfunded, and it was made through the collective effort of like a small group of people, like really dedicating themselves to it over a small period of time. And I didn't really know what I had when I opened it in front of an audience, but it certainly made a sense to me in writing it for there to be a moment when I turned the gun on myself, because really what's going on in that play is a massive spewing out of my own anxieties, right? And so to sort of name that and make that present felt necessary, felt like an honest thing to do or something. But in terms of the the writer, the figure of the writer being present in the work and that being made manifest in the work, it's true that that's there in a big way in Mouthpiece. The funny thing about the timeline of it is that it's not necessarily something that's then carried on from Heads Up for me, because Mouthpiece was actually in development for years before I started writing Heads Up. So it's like, as a maker and writer, these concerns are then the way that they overlap between different pieces are much more fluid over time than the kind of causal chronology that it might appear, to someone looking at the work, because Mouthpiece was in many ways, it was about me. The sort of very initial starting point of writing it was me trying to work through some of my own baggage and shit about my role as a writer and my position in the world and where I come from and the people that make that up and my particular position within all that and my own class confusion around all that. And there's a lot of me in it, even before you start getting to the fact that it's about a writer, so certainly I was wanting to explore a little bit around some of the structural politics of the theatre industry, but also, some of the ethics around storytelling. And it seemed to have catch a strange sort of zeitgeist around that, where there seems to have been quite a lot of writers writing about the act of writing recently, which could be like, to so many people hearing that, you'd be like, it sounds like the most navel-gazing, like, waste of time. And I hope that people don't think that a Mouthpiece, so they're entitled to it, but certainly the other plays that I'm thinking of aren't that. When you think of like The Writer by Ella Hickson, or like or Misty, or like a lot of big stuff in London has been dealing with that. And so it's sort of interesting to me. I don't know what that is when these things happen, but when writers' concerns all seem to coalesce around a certain thing, it's a kind of interesting moment.
And in Mouthpiece, there's also point at which the actor playing Declan refers to it as all very meta.
Yeah, he does.
And I guess this is what you're talking about. But that play comes to a head in the space of the theatre, where these issues have to be confronted.
Yeah.
And the reality of that individual and the story that he has to tell and his own life is brought into sharp contrast with the theatrical representation of his life in that space.
Yeah.
But the way that scene works is that it presupposes the presence of the actual theatre audience.
Yeah.
And I think this seems to be so central to a lot of the work that we've been talking about so far, is that the presence of the audience in the here and now of that moment is vital to those conversations and how they play out.
Yeah,
so
totally.
I'm wondering then, because you've recently ventured into writing for film, and there's a film adaptation of Beats, about 8 years after it was presented in the theatre. So how did you negotiate the absence of the audience in the process of putting that together? And did you find new strategies to have the same kinds of conversations with an imagined audience?
It's a really good question, and it's a totally different mode of storytelling. And I think a lot of writers that write initially for theatre that then move into writing for screen, it's easy to underestimate just how different it is, I think. And so the film had to become something very different for a whole number of reasons. So in the play, not just because it's live and it's in front of a live audience, but also because of the presence of me as writer, storyteller figure in the room. It allows you to do a whole bunch of things on a kind of narrative level. So you're just kind of moving from different places. You're deeply in the internal point of view of one character and the detail of their life. And you can, like Rantin makes a virtue of this in a very self-conscious, deliberate way. You can then zoom out and just zoom in and be somewhere else. Like, that's not possible in film. Of course it is. But there's something about the continual presence of the storyteller figure as an anchor for this that provides a kind of seamless continuity for an audience's experience. That is something that I'm writing subconsciously when making Beats. I'm only applying that to it later when going, how does this work in film? When we found that actually the policeman needs to not be from a different town, which he is in the play. He needs to be from the same town so that there's a coherent fictional world for us to invest in. and then not only does he not need to be in the same town, actually, with over redraft and redraft, we find he needs to be in the same family unit. And that was sort of making things work in a different, more satisfying way. So that's just like bare bones storytelling, structure stuff. In terms of the imagined audience, yeah, we played around with voiceover and stuff in early drafts of the screenplay that would address the people of the room in the same way. Even just at the very start, that introduces the stuff about the criminal justice bill or whatever, and then says none of this is real and all that. We played around with having that in the film, and it's not that that's not exciting to think about how that might work in film. It's just that it opened up more questions than answers, and it set us off on a path that was like, this is like a different kind of experimental art house experience that isn't actually the film we're making. Something to do with the fact that it was hard to avoid the disingenuousness around it. In theatre, if I'm performing my own words, I can walk out into the room and I can look the audience in the eye if it's a small black box studio, which it frequently is, and I can say hello.
You're there together making something in the same moment.
Exactly, and I can my welcoming of them, my addressing of them can be genuine, even though it's all through the artifice of theatre and it's under lights, because we literally are in the same space. If I address the audience in film, then I need to be addressing them for a very different set of reasons, because I don't know who I'm speaking to. I could be speaking to someone watching it on a laptop at home, or I could be speaking to a cinema with like 100 people in it. I don't know who I'm speaking to, so the way in which I speak to them has to be different. And all of this was just like shit that was going on that wasn't the part of the film we were making, so it kind of fell by the wayside. So it is a completely different, it's become a completely different thing. It's its own thing that I think retains the spirit of the original in a different medium, do you know?
Yeah. Well, as we move towards the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you about endings. Because in a lot of your plays, I'm thinking about Heads Up, about Rantin, about Hitch, and even Beats to an extent. And certainly Mouthpiece. There's a refusal to neatly tie everything together and to offer us a point of resolution. The narrative is often left very deliberately open, and what happens next is in a sense for the audience to decide and to act on. Did that differ with the film, and and what's your thinking about endings now that you've seen Mouthpiece in production and had a sense of how audiences leave those kinds of narratives and go off into the world and think about what they do next?
I think you always want to leave people with something that is useful for them to carry out into the world, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? And there is something, Mouthpiece is very explicitly having a conversation about the kind of limitations and even sometimes violence, really, of falsely closing a story that is not yet closed. So that's like really explicitly what it's trying to talk about in the end, that play. With a film, with Beats, without giving any, it's a slightly different story. So for people that have read or seen the play but have not yet seen the film, I still don't want to say too much because it is different. But there's definitely big questions about what happens in this friendship between these two boys, Jono and Spanner, that we're left with at the end. Then we also then did attempt to answer certain things for some of the characters, because part of what the film was trying to do is have a conversation between sort of Britain now and then, and sort of like looking at that, what happens next is bound up in what actually did happen in the intervening couple of decades. Do you know what I mean? And we're kind of trying to live in that space a wee bit. But yeah, that's definitely going on. I don't think I have a hard and fast rule about how I want to write an ending. And it's again one of those things where it's like, if we see a pattern, that's interesting. I just hope that I'm not a one-trick pony. But certainly I think that like I do have a continuing desire to leave the audience with something, whether it's a question or a thought or an impetus to act in some way that's useful, and so that inevitably has some kind of open-endedness to it.
And that seems like a very good open-ended point to end.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Kieran.
Thanks for having us. Cheers, man.